There are hundreds of embroidery stitches, but I'll show you 5 types that are easy to do if you've never embroidered before, and that can give different textures on your artwork. I'm going to move quickly and keep instructions specific to this craft kit, but if you'd like more in-depth stitch instructions, check out the links in the description or visit one of our embroidery kit playlists for other stitch ideas. In every skein of embroidery floss, there are 6 strands. So start by cutting a length of floss no longer than your arm. Otherwise it gets hard to manage. I've switched from my craft scissors to embroidery snips, which are extremely sharp, but that's because I do a fair amount of embroidery on a regular basis. So if you just have your regular scissors, you'll be fine. The next thing is to separate, I'll use this end since I already kind of separated it, to separate out 2 strands of embroidery floss, like this. Now you can either continue this process for a while. I say for a while. It only takes slightly longer than the other method that I'll show you. So I have my 2 strands here, or I could separate them out one by one by simply holding on to, pinching with one hand, holding on to the rest of the strands with the other, and pulling like this. That means that I have to separate them out one at a time. Boop, 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 boop. And then put them back together for sliding through the eye of my needle. But if you're doing a satin stitch or something where you really want to make sure your thread isn't twisted around it, then separating your floss out with, or strand by strand, can actually be very helpful. All right, let's get to threading the needle. Now there's the traditional kind of wet the tips of your fingers and then see if you can get it through the eye of the needle without the strands separating further. Or if you're having trouble with this, make a short loop, slide over the needle and slide your needle out, and then put, while you're still pinching this section, slide your needle over the top. But this is kind of old embroidery floss that I'm using, so I'm going to use the first method just to speed things along. But either way can work. The other thing to take note of is, are you going to tie your strands together or the ends together, or are you going to just stick with one? I'm going to recommend just sticking with one end tied off, because if you mess up and have to pull your floss out, then you can take the needle off and not have to cut your thread in order to backtrack. And I say this because I, mess up a lot, and if this is the first time that you've done embroidery, you might mess up too, and it's not a big deal. You can always just go back. All right, let's get to the back stitch. This might be the easiest stitch to create a solid line of embroidery. Poke holes in a line, which I pre-poked all of these holes, but you'll want to poke holes in a line and you want an even number, ideally. Now, coming up from the back side, you'll go 1 puncture over, come back down, make sure that the knot is against the back of the paper, and then I like to use my fingers to hold the extra thread out of my way before I come back up in the next hole. But here's where the back stitch starts, is because after I make this, well, we can call it an anchor stitch, then I'm going to go backwards so that I'm not skipping any space. Then I'm going to come up from behind through this next hole and then stitch back. So on the back side, I'm always skipping one puncture. And then on the front side, I'm always, and going forward. And on the front side, I'm always going back one. So skip one, go forward. And also, I am right-handed. So you'll notice that I started on the left and I'm going to the right. If you are left-handed, you start on the left, come one over, go down, come up in the next one, and then backwards to your right. And you'll be embroidering this way. So the nice thing about embroidery is that if you are left-handed, right-handed, or ambidextrous, you can always just switch which way your stitch is going to make whatever it is comfortable for you. So again, because I'm right-handed, I'm stitching from left to right. But if you're left-handed, you can stitch from right to left using the same method. So in a back stitch, I don't really have to worry about how many holes I have because I'm always going to end going down the hole before wherever I last came up. So I'll tie it off on the back. My favorite method to make a knot is to hold my needle here in front of my thread and then make 2 or 3 loops. Use my thumb to hold those loops in place and then just pull all the way through. And there's my knot. And that is the back stitch, one continuous line of embroidery. Next, I'll show you the stem stitch. The stem stitch done in a straight line makes a neat twisting effect, but it's also great for stitching around a curve. I'll show you. So like the back stitch, we are going to come up in our first hole, but we're going to skip one, go down in our second, and instead of pulling all the way through, I'm going to come up in that middle hole and keep my loop on the top side. And you could do it on the bottom side. Either way is fine. But you want to do, if you choose the top, you do the top every time. Now, I skip one hole, go down, make sure I don't pull all the way through. I'm going to hold a loop towards the top and come back down one hole prior. Skip one, go down, hold that loop towards the top, and then come up in the middle. Now, if your curve goes this way, for example, then you would want to keep the loop on the outside of that curve. So it would stay towards the top. But if my curve shape went this way, then I would want my loop to stay on the bottom so that the consistent edge is, or that twisting follows the same shape as the curve. If that makes sense. And the stem stitch is named because it looks like the vines or stems of flowers. Now, for my last stitch, do I come up in the center? No, I do not. So at the beginning and at the end, we don't have that twisting effect. If you wanted to, let's say, I think, oh, well, that's not long enough. I really want that kind of thickness at the end. So where's my cardboard? I'm going to grab my push pin and make a tiny hole just on the other side. So it's barely visible. You could do that too, but either way, it works. I'm going to tie my knot. And that is the stem stitch. Again, if you are going around a curve, the stem stitch makes a really nice curve shape. Just remember to keep your loop on the outside of the curve, the larger, not the inside of the curve, the larger outside of the curve. Now, let's try this chain stitch. The chain stitch is really great for texture. It kind of looks like a braid, which is why I used it for the rose in this example on this man's hair. And it's a little bit more complicated than the stem stitch. So I hope you'll think it's worth it. Try it for yourself. We're going to come up on the first hole. Again, I'm working left to right. And then we're immediately going to go back down that same hole. But here's the kicker. In order not to pull all the way through, I'm going to hold on to a loop. And since I'm going this way, I'm going to keep my loop on the right side of where I went down into the paper. Then on the back, I'm going to come up on the very next hole so that my needle is in the middle of this loop. And then I can pull all the way through. And that's the first chain. To continue, put your needle down in the same hole where you came up. Hold on to your loop. Go up in the next hole. And then pull all the way through. If you find that your thread is getting tangled a lot, then you might either be pulling too fast or you have too much thread. Come up through the next hole, hold the loop, pull all the way through. And if you would like your chain stitch to look really chunky, use either more strands of floss or put your punctures closer together. If you want it, let's say that you chose an image that has a gold chain and you want to do the Irmgard Guel technique of stitching that chain, well, this is a great stitch to use. I just say gold chain because I'm using yellow. You could really do it for whatever. Oh, if you had a striped thing and used back stitch on some of the stripes and chain stitch on other stripes, that could be pretty cool. The chain stitch also can go around curves pretty easily. So can the back stitch, but the back stitch is going to look a little more angled, kind of like a low resolution video game cast your mind back to Nintendo 64, the polygons. Whereas a stem stitch is going to look really curved, and a chain stitch, depending on how close your chains are together, is going to look like a rippled line. All right, how to end? Well, I don't want to make another loop, so I'm going to do a tiny anchor stitch. Oh, get off me. I'm going to, just on the other side, not so close that I rip the paper when I pull my needle through, but I'm going to put just another tiny hole next to the top of this loop, and then I can come back down and tie off. Chain stitch. Try it out. Tell me what you think. If you want to completely cover a large area, try satin stitch. This one does take a lot of floss. You'll have plenty, but it also takes a lot of puncturing. So this is what satin stitch looks like when it's done on fabric. As you can see, it completely covers an area except for the place that I deliberately left blank. And we're not going to be able to put our holes as close. So maybe if you really want it to be covered, then you could use more strands of floss, or you could color in the background the same, or paint the background the same color as your embroidery floss. But I wanted to show you what it looks like with just this amount of floss. And really, the satin stitch is just going up from the back. I could also come down if I wanted. Starting on one side of whatever shape, going down, coming up on the same side, going down. So unlike your back stitch or satin stitch, chain stitch, your other stitches, the back of something done with satin stitch is going to look almost the same as the front, maybe slightly angled. So if you have a shape that you want to completely fill, then use the satin stitch. Now, if you are wanting to kind of save your embroidery floss, the thread saving version of the satin stitch is to come up, go down, and then instead of coming up from the same side, simply move one puncture hole over and then go down from there. And again, thread saving version, go over one, and then up. And tying off is pretty easy. You're going to be on the back side of your paper. So I'll show you that now. The thing about the satin stitch is that when you are making your punctures, you want to make sure that you have the exact same number on the bottom of your shape as you do on the top. And let's say that you are doing a circle, then you would be going bottom to top. Or if you want your satin stitch to go this way, then rather than embroidering horizontally, I recommend turning your paper, making the punctures. And so you're always going top to bottom or bottom to top. The other thing about the satin stitch is it looks best when your holes are fairly evenly spaced. So this is where a ruler can come in pretty handy. I think I put these 1 millimeter apart. So I didn't even use the, or did I use the 16th inches? Maybe I used the 16th inches. So this is where my ruler really came in handy. And I want to use the satin stitch on one of my organic shapes. So that may be a little tricky. I'll have to figure that out as I go. But that's the satin stitch. I'm not going to do the whole thing because it takes a very long time. But I do recommend this stitch. It's pretty fun. Next, let's do some French knots. In this example made by our executive director, Jen Martin, she used French knots for these raised bumps. And I think I'll use them to attach some of my organic shapes to my background. So how do you make a French knot? And also, why is it French? I assume because it was first found in French embroideries. Embroidery is a tradition in so many cultures, so many different kinds of embroidery. So maybe the French had a big embroidery boom where they were just trying new stitches and saying, I like this, it's ours now. Who knows? A French knot come up from the back. And then I am going to make a knot the same way that I did when I was making knots on the back of my paper. I'm going to hold my needle in one hand, this trailing thread in the other, and then I'm going to loop my needle around. I'm going to do 3 times because I want to make sure it's bulky enough that it doesn't slip through the paper. And then I'm going to go back down in the exact same hole. I'm going to gently hold, and I'm not pulling too fast. And there it is. I'll come up through another hole. So let's say that you are wanting to make a cluster of little raised bumps. This is a great way to do it. You could also do a cluster of French knots in different colors. So you make a bunch of holes and you skip around with different colors. That could be really fun. I'll show you what it's like if you do a French knot and then go into a different hole. It has a different name. But if let's say I went down into a different hole, it would look like this. The thing about the French knot is that if this is a mistake, well, I can't undo it like I can with these other stitches because I've made a knot. So I could come up here, let's say I just want this to be every other one a French knot, then I'll do a back stitch. And then it could look like a line with a little bump in it. So I know that this is an entirely different stitch if I were to do a French knot with a back stitch. You could do that. I don't know what that stitch name is, but the French knot as just a little pop of embroidery is really cool. You can also do a lot more loops and go back in the same hole. The more loops you do, the more difficult it will be to pull the eye of your needle through everything and to make sure that it doesn't go squirrely on you. But then it's a taller and thicker knot. You could also experiment with how many strands of embroidery you use. Maybe you use 3 or 4. I divided them into two strands because I find it makes it easiest to pull through a pinhole. Oh, got stuck around the other knot. Shabloop. But a bulky French knot is a pretty cool thing. And then to tie off, same process on the back. French knots, a go-go. French knots for all my friends. Unless you, like I just did, accidentally catch the trailing end of your floss in the knot. Oh, there we go. It doesn't need to be too tidy. But why not get it as close to the paper as possible? French knots. What do you think? There are 3 stitches that I'm not demonstrating here: running stitch, seed stitch, and random stitch, because they're all simply going in and out of your background material without going back like this back stitch. So you go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Running stitch makes a dashed line, seed stitch is a running stitch but tiny, and random stitch just goes in any direction. The difference matters more in traditional embroidery on fabric than it does here. But I'll show you the starburst effect here, and these lines here could both be categorized as random stitch. So just to let you know, you don't have to have a straight line of embroidery. You could always just do a random stitch or have a dashed line with a running stitch, or make it itty bitty as a seed stitch. But the closer you make your holes, remember, the more chance you have of tearing the paper when you come up or down. So let's continue to embroidering our images.